What if the unbreakable fortress of the Donbass fell not with a roar, but with a tightening silence? Picture Avdiivka, a city transformed over more than a decade into the region's strongest defensive bastion. Its trenches and barricades, shaped by both modern tactics and hard lessons from past wars, were considered impenetrable by commanders and analysts alike. Throughout history, cities have become symbols of defiance. Think of Stalingrad in the Second World War, where entire armies were ground down in a frozen urban labyrinth. Or Dien Bien Phu in Indochina, where a French fortress was besieged until collapse. Avdiivka, in the eyes of many, was their 21st century echo. A fortress built to withstand not just a season, but generations of assault. The world expected that any attacker would bleed dearly to storm these lines. A frontal assault promised only catastrophic casualties, numbers no leader could justify. In the First World War, millions fell in the trenches for mere meters of ground. Commanders remembered these lessons. Yet, when Avdiivka fell, it was not in flames or glory, but beneath the weight of something far more insidious, the slow constriction of the anaconda strategy. Instead of battering the walls, Russian forces moved with patience, encircling the city inch by inch. They severed supply lines, isolated defenders, and drained hope with every passing day. The attack became a demonstration of operational discipline and relentless reconnaissance, proof that the rules of siege and defense are being rewritten before our eyes. To understand Avdiivka's collapse is to glimpse the future of warfare, where patience, precision, and information turn even the strongest positions into liabilities. If nations and leaders ignore this shift, they risk being blindsided by tactics that exploit their traditions and weaknesses, paying a price in security, credibility, and time that cannot be reclaimed. To unravel how Avdiivka's defenses crumbled, we must follow the step-by-step tightening of the noose. The story begins long before the first trench was breached. Avdiivka was no ordinary city. It stood as the anchor of a defensive line, a fortress whose reputation echoed far beyond its shattered concrete. The city's transformation was not spontaneous. It was the result of systematic, almost obsessive engineering, planning, and adaptation over more than 10 years. Each layer of defense was built with lessons from previous battles, and every mistake was sealed beneath new concrete and steel. Since the spring of 2014, Avdiivka had been transformed by relentless effort. Over more than 10 years, engineers carved a labyrinth of concrete layers and an underground web of tunnels. No other city in the region matched the depth and complexity of its defenses. Every apartment block and factory became more than shelter. They were strongpoints bristling with machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and hidden firing positions. At the center was the coke chemical plant, reshaped into a citadel within the city, its bunkers and reinforced lines ready for siege. Inside Avdiivka, as many as 15,000 elite Ukrainian troops waited. They were supplied by hundreds of kilometers of trenches and tunnels, supported by a ground laced with dense minefields, an invisible wall that could shred attackers before they ever reached the defenses. Bunkers were engineered to withstand the heaviest barrages. Industrial sites doubled as pillboxes, while even open ground hid deadly traps and concealed spotters. Western advisors helped design every layer, all with a single goal: to make Avdiivka a permanent dagger pointed at Donetsk, always threatening with artillery and blocking any easy advance. The intent was unmistakable. Avdiivka was built to be unbreakable. A frontal assault would not just bleed an army, it would shatter it. Losses here would be so staggering that morale, reputation, and even future campaigns could collapse. To misjudge these defenses was to risk more than defeat. It threatened strategic disaster, eroding commanders' credibility, emboldening the enemy, and shaking the confidence of both soldiers and civilians. In military history, there are examples of such overconfidence leading to disaster. The Maginot Line in France, built to be the ultimate barrier, was simply bypassed by German innovation in 1940. Sieges like Leningrad and Sarajevo remind us that even the strongest fortresses are vulnerable if surrounded and isolated. Yet, as this fortress loomed, Russian planners saw not just a wall, but a riddle. Instead of charging into certain destruction, they began to probe for a different way, a new method to break the unbreakable. This mindset echoes the tactics of Hannibal at Cannae, where encirclement and patience overwhelmed a larger Roman army. It also mirrors the slow siege of Vicksburg in the American Civil War, where starving the defenders achieved what cannon fire could not. But Avdiivka'S defenders, convinced of their city's impregnability, were about to face an enemy who would not repeat old mistakes. The coming battle would rewrite the rules of siege warfare. Victory did not come by shattering Avdiivka'S walls. It came by starving the city's defenders, squeezing until resistance collapsed from within. Russian command recognized that Avdiivka'S fortress could withstand any direct assault. Instead, they chose patience over force, unleashing what would be called the anaconda strategy, a slow, merciless encirclement meant to suffocate rather than smash. Troops avoided costly frontal attacks, focusing instead on severing supply lines and isolating the garrison. The goal was to create a noose, tightening with each passing day, denying the defenders ammunition, food, medicine, and hope. This was operational discipline, victory achieved by method, not by sheer numbers. The anaconda's northern coil was the Terracon, a massive slag heap near the coking plant. Whoever controlled this artificial hill commanded sight and fire over the city's approaches. Russians and Ukrainians fought bitterly here. Trenches and bunkers changed hands in nightly assaults. Drones buzzed above, feeding live intelligence to artillery crews. Night vision gave attackers the edge under cover of darkness, allowing assault groups to storm the heights. Once the Russians seized the Terracon, they could see and strike anywhere, turning every Ukrainian movement into a potential target. In the south, the battle was urban and claustrophobic. Industrial sprawl, tangled streets, mines, and booby traps. Rather than bleed themselves in block-by-block fighting, Russian units adapted. Infantry, tanks, engineers, and drones worked in concert, bypassing strongpoints and isolating resistance. Each gain was measured, each pocket methodically cut off. The ring drew tighter, the pressure mounting relentlessly. Above all, the attackers established overwhelming fire superiority. Precision artillery, guided bombs, and drone-directed strikes punished any attempt at resupply or escape. Air power circled overhead. Artillery blanketed every route. No relief could reach the defenders without running a deadly gauntlet. The Russians constructed a fire sack, a killing zone where any movement meant instant destruction. Inside, the garrison became prisoners, unable to bring in supplies or rotate exhausted troops. Their lifelines were severed, their strength slowly drained by unceasing surveillance and fire. For the Ukrainian defenders, the greatest danger was not the breach of their walls, but the slow, invisible death of their logistics. Underestimating the power of encirclement would prove fatal. For the attackers, the key was discipline, patience instead of impulse, precision instead of brute force. It was a victory not of mass, but of method and will. Yet, the true turning point arrived with the final surgical closure of the encirclement, a moment when hope for relief vanished and the fate of Avdiivka was sealed. With the noose drawn tight and supplies cut off, the defenders faced a bleak choice: endure starvation and bombardment, or attempt a desperate breakout. As winter deepened, the city's agony entered its final, excruciating phase. As the noose tightened around Avdiivka, chaos exploded, above and below ground. The last artery was severed when Russian forces captured the final industrial avenue, cutting off all supplies, reinforcements, and hope. Ukrainian defenders, isolated and desperate, mounted breakout attempts, but every assault shattered, smashed by unceasing artillery, dense minefields, and swarms of drones that shadowed every step. Below, the war plunged into the labyrinth. Tunnels once offering freedom became arenas of terror. Assault engineers surged through the blackness with explosives and flamethrowers, fighting at arm's length. Underground, defenders who once slipped unseen now found themselves stalked and trapped, their tunnels collapsing or captured, final exits sealed forever. Above ground, collapse accelerated. Russian reconnaissance strike complexes fused drones, electronic warfare, satellites, and human intelligence into a seamless web. Enemy positions were detected, targeted, and erased in near real time. Coordination or movement brought instant, crushing firepower. Radio intercepts captured panic. Ukrainian command unraveled as units lost contact, and orders clashed with chaos. Recordings carried not calm, but fear and despair. Evidence of total operational breakdown. The lesson was brutal. Adapting to the new tempo of war was no longer optional. Those clinging to static defenses, or fighting for symbolism instead of survival, faced annihilation. The price of failing to innovate was counted in lives lost and fortresses erased. So, what did the world learn from the fall of Avdiivka, a fortress brought down not by brute force, but by a new kind of war? Avdiivka's destruction sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. The world now faced urgent questions about the future of warfare and who would survive its next evolution. The collapse of an unbreakable fortress reveals more about the minds defending it than the walls themselves. Avdiivka'S fall did not simply redraw front lines. It rewrote the hidden rules of war, exposing the dangers of clinging to concrete, legacy, and myth. Defenders made fatal mistakes. Obsessed with Avdiivka'S symbolism, they placed faith in Soviet tunnels and layers of NATO-supplied arms, convinced these would guarantee survival. Leadership was slow, rigid, and underestimated the encirclement closing in. Overconfidence in Western gear obscured a harsher reality. Technology, without innovation in thinking, cannot rescue a misjudged plan. Doctrine had quietly shifted. Russian forces refused to play by the old book. Instead of costly frontal attacks, they fused intelligence, rapid targeting, and constantly evolving tactics. This blend, real-time surveillance, precision strikes, and patient encirclement, outmaneuvered the defenders at every turn, turning old strengths into new vulnerabilities. The fortress became a trap. Once supply lines were severed, those inside could only watch as food and ammunition dwindled and hope faded. The illusion of Avdiivka'S impregnability shattered in mere days. Morale collapsed, and defensive cohesion broke apart, leaving the defenders isolated and exposed. This was not just a loss on the battlefield. Russian innovation seized the initiative, forcing defenders into hasty withdrawals to weaker, less fortified lines. Command paralysis and doctrinal inflexibility proved as ruinous as any weapon. The lesson is unforgiving. Ignoring the dynamic interplay between technology, psychology, and adaptive leadership risks not just defeat, but irrelevance. In an era of rapid military change, rigid thinking is fatal. Historical parallels can be found in the fall of Singapore in 1942, when British forces, believing in the impregnability of their fortress, were outmaneuvered and forced into surrender. Or in the case of the Siegfried Line in Germany, another massive set of fortifications that ultimately failed due to innovative enemy tactics and shifting technologies. Each time, the pattern is clear. Static defenses, when not adapted to the evolving nature of warfare, become liabilities instead of strengths. Avdiivka'S fall is a warning shot that echoes far beyond the battlefield. What comes next will test whether militaries can adapt, or if they will repeat history's mistakes. When so-called unbreakable walls give way to unexpected thinking, what happens to your own certainty? The fall of Avdiivka in the year 2025 was not merely a shift in territory. It shattered the legend of the untouchable fortress, a symbol of concrete, trenches, and unyielding faith in doctrines that should have faded long ago. For years, it stood as proof that raw construction and rigid tactics could hold back any assault. Yet, it was not brute force that brought Avdiivka down. It was a mind that moved faster than the strongest walls. Russian strategy did not rely on waves of men crashing against defenses. Instead, it unfolded with the patience of a hunter. Encirclement, information dominance, and seamless multi-domain pressure. The so-called anaconda method squeezed the fortress from every angle, cutting supplies, isolating units, and employing everything from precision-guided munitions to psychological operations. The defenders, once certain their position was unbreakable, found themselves paralyzed, starved of support, cut off from hope, and outmaneuvered in both mind and matter. This was not just a victory of hardware. Drones mapped every meter of movement. Real-time intelligence turned chaos into order. But the deeper victory was mental. Russian planners and troops proved that patience, adaptation, and technological edge, when fused, can break through where brute strength always fails. The fortress, built to last decades, fell in days to a force that understood modern war better than its builders ever imagined. It is important to see that this is not a uniquely Russian innovation, nor is it a tactic that only applies to Eastern Europe. Think of the Israeli encirclement of Egyptian Third Army in the Yom Kippur War, or the US-led coalition's use of precision strikes and cutting off supply lines in the Gulf War, which rendered massive Iraqi defenses obsolete. The lesson is universal. Adaptability and information dominance are now more decisive than concrete and steel. Now turn the question inward. What fortresses do you hold sacred in your life, your work, your nation? What beliefs have become your walls? The defenders of Avdiivka clung to their certainty, refusing to see a new kind of threat until it was too late. Anyone, leader, institution, or individual, can be outflanked by innovation that slips through the cracks of old thinking. The danger is not theoretical. Failure to adapt, to rethink, to anticipate, means gambling everything on truths that expired yesterday. Security, influence, even the future itself, can dissolve when change moves faster than belief. Avdiivka'S story is a warning written in concrete and ash. No defense is permanent, and no lesson is truly yours until you act on it. So ask yourself, will you cling to walls built for another era, or will you tear them down and build with new ideas? The fate of the unbreakable is not just history. It is a challenge to everyone who would rather hide behind certainty than embrace change. Let's consider what practical steps armies and individuals can take to avoid the fate of Avdiivka. For militaries, it means building flexibility into doctrine, constantly wargaming new scenarios, and prioritizing intelligence gathering as much as firepower. Leaders must foster cultures where bad news travels quickly, and innovation is rewarded, not punished. Training should emphasize improvisation and decentralized decision-making, as seen in successful units throughout history, from the German Auftrags tactic to the U.S. Marine Corps' maneuver warfare doctrine. For nations, it means investing not just in hardware, but in software, the minds and information systems that turn data into advantage. It means integrating new technologies, like artificial intelligence-enabled targeting and autonomous drones, but also understanding their limits and vulnerabilities. No technology is a panacea. Just as the tank was once thought to be unstoppable, only to be checked by new anti-tank weapons and tactics, today's innovations can quickly become tomorrow's weaknesses, if not used wisely. For individuals, the lessons are equally stark. The walls you build in your own life, beliefs, routines, habits, can become traps if you are not vigilant. Adaptation is not a one-time event, but a constant process. Be willing to challenge your assumptions, seek out new information, and learn from failure. The greatest danger is not being wrong, but refusing to see when the world has changed around you. The story of Avdiivka is not just a chronicle of military defeat. It is a parable about the consequences of inflexibility and the rewards of adaptation. In the end, the unbreakable fortress fell, not because its walls were weak, but because its mind was slower than its enemy's will. Let us close the question debt by returning to Avdiivka itself. The city now lies in ruins, a stark testament to the cost of misjudging the future. Yet, in its fall, there is a challenge and an invitation to learn, to adapt, and to build anew. Whether in war, work, or life, the fate of the unbreakable is a warning and a guide. The walls of yesterday cannot protect you from the storms of tomorrow, unless you are willing to change. The next fortress, literal or metaphorical, is already being tested. Will you see the encirclement coming, or will you trust too much in concrete, tradition, and hope? The answer, as always, is up to you.